If you played Call of Duty on public servers, you've probably seen someone precisely position themselves and rise straight up into the sky like they're standing on an invisible lift. It's been happening for years, and until now, nobody has really understood why it works, let alone how to stop it. Hello everyone, I'm Rex, and today we're cracking open the code behind Call of Duty 4's elevator glitch. We are going to look at obscure logic buried into the engine and discover how developers attempted to solve curious problems with some surprisingly clever tricks. Elevators come down to precise positioning. Position your character under a vertical wall and move it forward slowly, unit by unit. Some players do this manually with movement binds. Others use a tool called EliBot that automates the process. There are 3 known variants. Crouch or prone elevators, pretty much the most common type. Crouch or prone, shift your position slightly, then stand up until it triggers. Running elevators. Crouch and run parallel to the wall with a slight offset until a character stands up on its own and triggers the glitch automatically. Jumping elevators, the rarest type. Jump at exactly the right spot to trigger it. I've never pulled one of these off myself, but I know they are real. Sorry, but I don't have any clip of this. Once you got the muscle memory down, any of these can be triggered in seconds. But the question is, what is the engine actually doing? To understand the glitch, we first need to understand how CoD4 tracks objects in the world. Every player's position is stored as a vector. Around that point sits a collision box, defined by 2 corners called mins and maxes. If we want to find the distance between 2 points, we use this formula. This will return the magnitude, also known as the length of a vector. As you may have noticed, the magnitude of the player's position is just the distance from the world's origin. CoD4 runs on a modified Quake 3 engine called IW3.0. The original Quake developers faced a persistent problem: players getting stuck inside geometry. Their solution was a function that automatically unstucks the player whenever this happened. That function is called PMCorrectAllSolid. I have to give a massive thank you to the guys who created Cod, who provided the entire reverse-engineered and clean codebase for this project. Without them, this would have been really hard. Before explaining what the function does in detail, we must define what PM_player_trace is. PM_player_trace is essentially a wrapper of 2 different types of traces. If the starting position and the end position are the same, a point trace is triggered. This just checks if the player is inside a solid geometry in that specific position. On the other hand, if the starting position and the end position are different, a swept trace is triggered. It sweeps the player's bounding box through the world. It doesn't just check if the player would fit in a given space. It checks if the volume of the player would touch something if it would have moved along 2 points. With that out of the way, let's examine what PM_correctAllSolid does. The function begins by retrieving the player's current state and entering a loop that cycles through 26 fixed direction vectors covering all major axes and diagonals in 3D space. For each element, it calculates a trial coordinate by point tracing in the direction of that specific vector. For some reason, the developers made the first element of correct solid deltas a perfectly up vector. Oddly enough, the bug relies on this very thing for it to work. If the position is free, the engine immediately updates the player's origin to that position. It then casts a swept trace to locate the ground and smoothly place the player down to that surface, returning success. If all 26 directions result in a solid collision, the function exits without moving the player, indicating they are truly stuck. Pretty straightforward, huh? So, where does this fail? Here's where it gets interesting. The function PM_correctAllSolid doesn't run randomly. It's triggered by PM_groundTrace. It casts a vertical swept trace with a small tolerance of 0.25 units above and under the player to check if you're truly stuck inside something. If you are, try to unstuck the player using PM_correctAllSolid. On the contrary of what everyone thinks when you're triggering an elevator, you're not really inside a wall, you're just perfectly aligned with it. The point trace works beautifully and does not detect any overlap. Your gap with the wall is essentially absolute zero. So, frame by frame, the engine tries to fix you by lifting your character up, even though you're not overlapping with anything. You're just pretty much sliding up the wall. Wait, something doesn't add up. We saw that to trigger PM_correctAllSolid, you must already be inside a wall. Following this logic, the elevator bug should never happen. It would just work exactly as intended. Yeah, something else is definitely going on here. Let's see what the swept trace is doing under the hood. This is the internal function used for the swept trace. There is something strange about it. Can you spot it? This tiny number. This small offset is everywhere in the engine. It is the epsilon that keeps your collision loose enough to feel smooth, but tight enough to stop you going through walls. This is what makes the glitch possible. It creates that gray zone where the swept trace sees a collision, but the point trace sees a clear path. Let's try to go back and explain the bug once and for all. Suppose you are in the correct position to trigger an elevator. First of all, PM ground trace perform a vertical swept trace. Because of the small epsilon distance, the trace detects the nearby wall. This immediately calls PM_correctAllSolid, which attempts to unstuck the player. PM_correctAllSolid tests every entry in correct_solid deltas. The goal is to find the best position to move the player to. Remember the first element in the list? Unfortunately for the developers, this candidate actually passes the check, because the player isn't truly embedded into the wall. A point trace confirms that the position is valid. Then the player gets moved to that new position, leaving the rest of the work to the next cycle, which triggers exactly the same logic until the player just gets on top of the wall. Later Call of Duty titles eventually patched this. Their fix was surprisingly simple. After finding a supposedly free position, they would jitter it slightly and test it again before committing to the move. It's a cheap sanity check that catches exactly this kind of false positive. A different kind of fix can be implemented to a CoD4 Unleashed or CoD4X server. But since editing PM_correctAllSolid directly means losing the fix every time the server updates, and memory hacking DLLs are fragile, I solved it entirely in GSC. My script fires 4 traces every frame from north, east, south, and west. Each trace starts 1 player radius away from the player's center and ends at the player's current position. If a trace reports a fraction of exactly 0.875, which is 1 minus 0.125, it means that the trace hit a wall at the very end of its path. In other words, the gap between the player and the wall is exactly 0, the exact condition required to trigger an elevator. By detecting that epsilon-sized gap, the script can identify the setup with complete certainty and stop the exploit before it ever happens. The full GSC script is available on my Discord modding community called ManyAsset. The link is in the description below, together with my personal Discord and Kaisak COD repository URL. If you know something about elevators I didn't cover here, drop it in the comments. Thanks for your attention, and see you in the next video.